Hello, Coeur d'Alene. You know, I don't get up here on the stage very often, so I think I'm going to be squinting with this light a little bit. I just say that so you know I'm not angry. I'm just squinty, that's all. So I've got a question to start with, and it might not be an obvious question at first, so I just ask that you bear with it for a few minutes and it'll make sense, I promise. And the question is this: right here, right now, who are you as someone who can grow? Who are you as someone who can be more tomorrow than you were yesterday? Who are you as someone who can be fulfilled? It seems like kind of a strange question to start with, maybe? You know, as a counselor years ago, I spent a lot of time in people's psychological basements. And I always saw that as a privilege, and I still do. Now, unfortunately, even though some of those psychological basements are filled with treasured memories of dreams fulfilled, many more tended to be filled with doubts and fears and regrets. And that's normal. That is so normal, as a matter of fact, that some research today indicates that as many as 90% of us have significant regrets in our life. The majority of those being missed opportunities. 9 out of 10 in here, that's a lot of people. Other research suggests that if we're just talking amongst ourselves, the most commonly mentioned emotion is love. That's great. Do you know what the second most commonly mentioned emotion is? It's regret. Wow. So if we're talking about normal, what it means just to be a normal human being, regret seems to be a part of the package. Now, there was one young lady that I worked with and came to know pretty well years ago. And for me, her life story just seemed to be a powerful metaphor for this kind of normal, because she danced in the dark. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Maybe once a week, she would step down the stairs, literally into her basement. She would turn off the lights. She'd turn on her special music, and she would just dance until she laughed and cried and exhausted herself. And all she was doing was being herself. She was being who she was. She'd dream dreams, she'd imagine them coming true, and she'd dance. Now, of and by itself, absolutely nothing wrong with dancing in the dark. But it's what she would do next that would create a problem. See, she'd turn off her music, she'd turn on the lights, she'd go back upstairs, and she would do everything she possibly could to make sure nobody knew what she liked to do. To make sure no one knew who she was. To make sure nobody knew her dreams. To make sure nobody knew what made her happy. Why? Fear of failure, fear of rejection. Can you imagine how unfulfilled she was? You can, right? I think most of us can. Now, don't worry, we're not going to stay in this gray place for very long. Personally, I think that when we do reality checks like this, it can give us traction and then we go places we actually want to go. And the reason that I start with such an extreme example is just because it generalizes well to a very specific point. And the point is this, and just tell me if you agree. Hiding who you are creates a sense of unfulfillment. Would you agree with that? Yeah, I think most of us would. Hiding who you are creates a sense of unfulfillment. When you hide some unique perspective, when you hide a real dream, when you hide a gift or a talent, something for which you're born or you're hardwired, however you want to look at it, when you hide these parts of yourself, you're not just missing an opportunity to do something. You're missing an opportunity to become someone. You're missing a chance to live. You see how this takes us back to that first question? Who are you? Does it matter? If you want to be fulfilled, it does. Now, I would imagine there's quite a few of you that are ahead of me here, and that's good. On a day like today and with a talk like this, we could go all sorts of directions, but really, we're taking the simplest route today. This talk is just about courage. Courage. I honestly believe, from research and from my own experience as a counselor, that many, if not most of us, to some degree, put a part of ourselves in the basement and we dance with ourselves in the dark. And there's a lot of reasons that we could do this. But honestly, I think one of the biggest reasons is just that when we look inside of ourselves and we look at our dreams, they just seem so much bigger than we are. And we don't see a mountain of courage inside of ourselves. So we put that dream in the basement, and maybe once a month or once a year when we're feeling unfulfilled, and we do, we go down into the basement and we dance with ourselves in the dark. Don't worry, I won't ask for a show of hands, but we all know who we are. So I've got 2 stories for us today. 2 stories to illustrate the power of courage, its accessibility to us, which is very important, and the value of courageous connection. And that may be the most important thing of all. Not dancing in the dark, but dancing in the light. The first of these stories is a story of a world-renowned individual, and I just start with this person because whenever I think of courage, I think of this person. It's every single day of their life they stepped out on courage, and you'll see what I mean in just a moment. The second story is really more of a slice of life anecdote. It's a very intimate look at a particular individual who's not world-renowned, but just a very small person in a very big place. And I mention this individual because it's an example of a choice that became a transformational moment. And sometimes those sort of intimate looks, they're more than edifying. They actually can touch our heart. And when our heart is touched, we gain some energy, we can make a choice, we can go someplace that we might not have gone before. So, does anybody recognize this quote? Here's a quote. Security is mostly a superstition. I'll give you a hint. There's a hint right there. She was born in Alabama in 1880, and I think she lived until 1968, and communication was a huge deal for this gal. Anybody recognize who said that security is mostly a superstition? Helen Keller, that's right. Helen Keller. I have a Helen Keller magnet on my refrigerator that has a Helen Keller quote, and every day I just have to read it and soak it up into my soul. It's so perfect. Helen Keller has perfect quotes. So I would imagine that most of us have heard the name Helen Keller, and some of us have heard the story. For those of us who may not be as familiar, I'm just going to give you the short version today. As I mentioned, Helen was born, Alabama, 1880, and she became so sick when she was 19 months old, not 19 years old, but 19 months old. She was just a toddler. She became so sick that she lost her ability to both see and hear. And because she's just a child and she can't process this experience at all, she becomes a rageful child. So from that point until she was between 6 and 7 years old, the people in the local community just wrote her off. Some would say, she will never amount to anything, or she'll never even act like a human being. And then, of course, between 6 and 7 years old, on the scene comes Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan, who became Helen Keller's teacher ultimately, but Anne Sullivan herself had grown up in very difficult circumstances. Think of, the 1880s. Anne Sullivan had grown up in a poorhouse, and she herself was visually impaired. But because of Anne Sullivan's energy, because of her determination, her dedication, and personally I think of her own brand of genius, and ultimately because of who Helen Keller was, Helen Keller is on the list of the most influential people of the 20th century. Wow, right? Deaf and blind. Most influential people of the 20th century. How many of us have seen the movie The Miracle Worker? Has anyone seen one of them? Yeah, a lot of us have seen it. Trivia-wise, a lot of people think there's 2 Miracle Worker movies. There's actually 4 Miracle Worker movies. The first one was in 1919. It was a silent film, and it wasn't called The Miracle Worker, but it has all those images and all that story. The second one, I think, was in 62. Next was in 79, and the last was in the year 2000. If you haven't seen The Miracle Worker movie, and you want a moving movie, it's a wonderful movie, but you might want to have some Kleenexes when you watch it. Whichever version that you see, they all have what I call the iconic pump scene. And I call it iconic because the whole movie, the whole story, the whole point of the Miracle Worker movie revolves around this pump scene. And basically what's happening is there's a water pump in the front yard. Helen Keller is between 6 and 7 years old. She's standing there at that water pump, and she has her hands under that cold water. Anne Sullivan is at the business end of that pump, and she is just frenetically pumping that pump, and water is gushing out. And really, that moment is a metaphor for what's been happening in the months up until that moment in Helen Keller's life, because Anne has been desperately trying to get Helen to understand the concept of language, the concept of basic communication. So she's been using sign language in Helen's hands, and that entire time Helen hasn't gotten it. But in that moment, as that cold water is hitting her hands, Helen's hands, again, Anne reaches over and puts the sign language for water in her hands, and finally Helen gets it. Not just the word, not just water, but she gets the whole concept. Language. There is a way to connect our inner worlds, which are often places of frustration and unfulfillment, with the outer world, which is often a place of opportunity and anxiety. And from that point on, Helen's life changes. It is no longer an experience of frustration and rage. It is now an experience of opportunity and dreams the size of mountains, as long as she continues forward with courageous connection. Helen's story is many things. It is a story of miracles. It's a story of discovery. It's a story of adventure. But it's also a story of something we don't think about a lot. It's a story about the human need to connect our inner world with the outer world. And because she did, despite her inner physiological darkness, because every single day she stepped out in that darkness and she connected her inner experience with the outer world, because she did, she is on the list of the most influential people of the 20th century. Why? Because she changed the way people and cultures around the world view and value peoples with disabilities. She changed the world. Game changer. Who are you? Could you be a game changer too? You know, I mentioned I had a second story. And this is not a world-renowned individual. This is a very small person in a very big place. I mentioned years ago I worked as a counselor. And as a part of moving towards that position as a counselor prior to getting an education, I worked for a while in a facility, just in process of moving towards that experience as a counselor. I worked in a facility that could best be described as institutionalizing the people who were inside. If you just imagine a massive citadel on the hill, you'll have a mind's eye view of this particular location. Now, because we as volunteers weren't qualified to provide therapy or any kind of clinical intervention, the reason that they wanted us there was very simple. All we were really doing was socializing. And I think you can pretty easily understand why that would be important if you think you've got a lot of people in this location all together and they're all missing some sense of normalcy, right? Automatically, they're just on a negative social vector. They're bringing each other down. So we would go in and we would just do our best to be normal. It was hard, but we pull it off every now and then. So basically, we're playing chess and checkers and reading magazines with them and talking about movies and so on and so forth. But one of the things that the clinicians there would let us do was they would let us put on a dance. So we did. We put on a fall dance. We got a playlist, we got music equipment, we got lights, we got all this stuff, and we hosted a dance for the folks who were inside. Now, I need to back up just for a moment and introduce you to really the individual that I'm talking about here. There was one person in this facility that to me stood out, and they just stood out because they appeared lost. It's just lost. This lady was between 60 and 70 years old. She was thin to the point of gaunt. And because of degradation over the years, she'd lost her capacity to speak as a human. She lost her ability to articulate words. And it's not that she wouldn't try. She would try with desperation. She would try to speak and just it'd come out nonsense and gobbledygook, and she'd get louder and louder and louder and frenetic, and you can imagine if there was anyone around her, it would come across as almost a violent experience, and so everybody would get away from her. It was sort of like the Helen Keller story in reverse. With the Helen Keller story, you have a child who can't connect, and then ultimately they can. Whereas here's a woman who ostensibly as an adult had the capacity to connect, but as she ages, she finds herself more and more alone and lost in her own inner darkness. It was really a tragedy. Well, on the night of that dance, the administration had given us an absolutely massive hall in this facility. It was about 4 times as big as what we needed. So we set up our dance, our music, and everything over here in a quarter, and administration had turned off the lights in all the rest of this room, so it's just increasing darkness as it goes over here. So the clinicians and the staff are bringing in the people that are going to be a part of this dance in ones and twos, and I see this lady that I just introduced you. I see them bring her in, and they bring her in over here, but then she goes over here into the darkness. Why do you think she did that? Because that's her normal. So as a volunteer, it's nothing for me with a clinician nearby for me just to walk over to her where she is in the darkness and say, hey, I really would love to dance with you. Can you step into the light? And you can imagine her initial response, big eyes and tension and shaking and louder vocalizations. And so I just take a step back and I say again, I really would love to dance with you. Can you step over into the light? And again, the same big eyes and tension and vocalization. But this time, at the end, she just cocks her head to one side and looks curious. So I can only ask one more time. I can't stiff arm her over into a dance. So I asked the last time, I really would like to dance with you. Will you step into the light? And she looks at me for a second. Then her hand comes up. And after another pause, she takes one step forward in the darkness. Not having a sense of perfect control. Not really knowing where that moment would go. Not even having the capacity to negotiate it through language. But sensing an opportunity, she took a step forward. And then she took another step and another step and another step until we're in the light on the dance floor. Slow song comes on. And based on the old school protocol, her hands went on my shoulders and my hands went on her waist. And for 5 minutes, we just started swaying to the music. And as we swayed, it was like 30 years of tension just flowed away. 30 years of shadows. And it seemed like she came home. So when the song ended, she opened her eyes, and after not speaking for decades, just said, "Thank you." It's a beautiful story, isn't it? Courageous connection. Of course, I have to offer a cautionary thought. I'm not suggesting that we make foolish relational choices. The scenario that I just described was a very controlled scenario. But even as the Helen Keller story is many things, so is that story. And one of the things it's an example of the kind of transformation that only happens with courageous connection. I'd like to leave us with a couple of thoughts. The first one is this. I really believe that many of us misunderstand what courage is. We idealize it. We think courage is the size of a mountain. When we look inside of ourselves, we don't find a mountain of courage. That's not courage. Humans only live in one moment at a time. And sometimes those moments are pretty dark. Courage is one step forward, even in the darkness. And that's how accessible it is to us. It's one step. Now, human connection is a lot more complicated, and there's no way we could define that in a 22-minute talk. But however you define human connection increases our capacities to live. Do you want to grow? Connect. Do you want to be more tomorrow than you were yesterday? Connect. Do you want to be fulfilled as a human being? Connect. Find your human connections. Ask them to tell you their story. Ask them to tell you their dreams, and be courageous enough to tell them yours. Tell them who you are. So for the last time today, you guessed it. Who are you?